I'm Richard Harris, and welcome to Real Risk, the podcast that talks to people who put themselves in harm's way. You know the type. Big wave surfers, professional soldiers, base jumpers. I'll get inside the heads of men and women who seem fearless or even reckless. They might seem crazy to us, but most are far from it. We'll be talking about putting your life on the line for something important. We're talking about real risk. In 2018, I had the pleasure of finally meeting an adventurer I'd admired for years. She had been nominated as the 2019 South Australian of the Year for becoming the first woman to achieve one of mountaineering's most difficult quests, the 7-7. Only 7 other people have achieved this goal, and she hasn't stopped there. A successful businesswoman, a strong supporter of multiple charities, and a mother of 3 children, she reminds me of the adage, if you want something done, ask a busy person. It's a great honour to welcome Katie Sarah as my first guest on Real Risk. Katie Sarah, thank you so much for joining me on Real Risk, and thanks for being generous and having a little bit of courage in being the first guest on the podcast. Now, we're going to want to know what the 7-7 involves and what exactly is the Explorers Grand Slam. But before we do so, tell us a little bit about what a young Katie Sarah looked like. Did you grow up in Adelaide?
Oh, big sweeping questions to start. Yes, I pretty much did grow up in Adelaide. Spent a couple of years in Sydney as a young child, but yeah, definitely Adelaide through 49 of my 51 years. So yes, grew up in Adelaide and have lived here definitely all of my adult life.
And what was your family like? Were they a family of adventurers or office workers, or tell me about them?
My father was a bank manager, so I think that possibly speaks volumes. Definitely not adventurous by any stretch. I did not pick up any of the adventuring stuff until I was in my mid-30s. So although in my 20s I was doing endurance stuff, so I was doing triathlon, which gradually grew longer and longer from short ones and then slightly longer when I was around 30, but definitely not anything really out there as far as risk or adventure was concerned.
And what about siblings? Have you got brothers or sisters?
Yes, I have an older sister.
And what's she into?
She's not into adventure, but she definitely gets out into the hills and loves a hike and takes her dogs for walks and that sort of thing. So she's definitely aware of health and fitness, but not quite the risk profile possibly that I have.
So looking back to a young Katie Sarah, could you have pictured as a young girl that you would be climbing mountains later in your life, or was that just not in
goodness,
your...
No. I climbed my first peak in 2006, so I was in my mid-30s. And even a month or so after that, one of the members of that team said, you'll go out and climb Everest next. I was like, no, don't be ridiculous. I've just climbed a 6,500 metre peak. Everest is, no. And then 6 months later, I was on Everest for the first time. So it was a quick introduction, certainly, to climbing, but definitely not something I would ever have considered in my teens or 20s. In fact, even in my early 30s, I remember doing it. It was at work, and it was one of those quizzes to get to know each other. And it's like, what do you want to do? What are your goals coming up? And it's like, by my 40th birthday, maybe I could maybe try and climb Kilimanjaro. And by my 40th birthday, I'd been on Everest to 8,400 metres. So, yeah, it was definitely pun intended, a big leap from what I thought I could possibly do in my early 30s to what I was doing in my early 40s.
So what was that first peak, the 6,500 metre one?
So that was the highest peak in Bolivia, called Nevada Sayama, and it's pretty straightforward. It's a trekking peak, but it was really quite a tough peak on the day. So there was the terrain was quite difficult in that it was still just hiking, but there were fixed ropes, and it was really quite hard work. So so I was actually the only one on the team of the clients that summited.
Can you see Lake Titicaca from there?
Not from the peak, but we did visit Lake Titicaca. Beautiful, beautiful spot.
Yeah, that's about my highest exposure to altitude, I think, around that area in Peru. The Peru side of Lake Titicaca, we did the Inca Trail, which I think maxed out at about 4,200 metres. And I found myself wanting, to be honest. I think, and obviously as someone who's interested in wilderness and expedition medicine, I've read a fair bit about mountain medicine. And I understand that, sometimes it's not really related to fitness or age, but really there's probably a genetic component as to how people fare on the mountain. And I wonder if my genetic makeup is not suited to mountaineering. Did you find you took to it, or did you struggle initially?
I did take to it, and I certainly agree that your ability to acclimatise can be genetically predisposed. So no matter how fit you are, no matter how well you prepare, everything might be right, but if you're genetically not able to acclimatise, then that is obviously going to work against you. I would say from experience that most of the time people that aren't acclimatising well, there's another factor, and it can be behavioural or physiological at the time. So they can be harbouring something that they've picked up and that knocks them flat, or they think that they can go at high speed like they can running up Mount Lofty here at 6,000 metres, and that's just never, ever going to end well. So often it is other factors. So just because you have a bad experience once, I'd always say, well, within safety limits, give it another crack, because it might not be physiological. It might be just something that was going on with you on that trip.
It did give me just that tiny insight into what life, at significant altitude must be, with the nausea and the headache and the breathlessness, obviously, and minimal exercise making you feel pretty puffed. Add 4,000 metres to what I experienced, and I think that I could barely conceive of what life above base camp at Everest must be like. And I think it must really sort out the sheep from the goats in terms of strength of character. And I guess you've seen a bit of that.
Definitely. However, once you've acclimatised to a particular altitude, you're not, like for a 6 or 7 week Everest trip, you're not feeling nauseous with a terrible headache the whole time. So just to reassure you, once you have acclimatised to an altitude, yes, if you try and carry a heavy backpack or duffel bag or whatever, then even if you're acclimatised, you'll probably feel it. But those initial symptoms, if you're acclimatising, do go away.
So just for our listeners, Katie and I live in South Australia in Adelaide, not a state that is known for its mountains, and Mount Lofty, as was referred to, is just behind the city of Adelaide and has the enormous altitude of 600 or 700 metres, I think. Is that correct? Approximately
780 above sea level. If you're doing the walk from the car park, you're actually gaining about 400 metres.
But on its day, a very tough climb in my view.
It is steep, and if you can, and it's wonderful that there are quite a few. There's crowds on Mount Lofty these days, which is great. Seeing people come out and get into the Adelaide Hills. But as a training walk, it actually is a good one if you can find a quiet time, because there are steep sections. So I'd prefer and go and find a similarly steep hill with 5% of the people. But
have you noticed how many people have been up in the hills during the corona situation?
Oh, absolutely, yes. The hills, Victoria Park, just nearby to our homes, the number of people out there is great to see. The families, people just out walking, kids on bikes. It's wonderful.
It's good to see kids outside doing stuff.
Yes, definitely.
So from Mount Lofty, 700 odd metres to 6,500 is a huge step. Was there anything between?
No.
Straight up there.
Short answer. So I was hiking and so on, and I'd run a couple of marathons and been doing triathlons in my early 30s. And then the first opportunity, after I'd sort of thought, Kilimanjaro might be fun, there was a Adelaide group going to Bolivia to do this peak, and that opportunity was for a 6,500 metre peak.
So was there a key person or someone you admired in that group who egged you on to take on something so radically different to what you'd experienced?
So I had met Duncan Chessel a couple of years before that, and he was the one that let me know about this group and this opportunity. He was certainly the one that on that trip and on a number of subsequent trips was there to coach me on how to manage altitude and acclimatise best. So, yeah, I guess it was the opportunities were put in front of me, as I said, a few months after that trip, the Everest opportunity came up. So the opportunities were sort of dangled in front of me and I just seized them. It was, I can do it, I can get there, have a go.
So how did you feel about the 6,500 metres? Did you come away from that feeling like it was tough but quite doable?
Yes, it was definitely tough, as I said, because I was the only one that summited on the day, and there were some very fit blokes on that trip and some with experience at altitude. So it was a difficult summit day. But for me, I guess because it was my first attempt at altitude, it sort of said to me that, okay, I'm good at hurting myself enough to get fit and strong enough before the trip. And then I've got the mental discipline to keep on going on summit day.
And was there an acclimatisation period on that trip?
Yes, absolutely. So I think you mentioned Peru before. So we went to Peru, stayed in Cusco, we went to Machu Picchu, then we came down through Lake Titicaca. And so all of that was lovely tourism, but all at altitude and a part of our acclimatisation. So it was a 3-week trip, which is about right for a 6,500 metre peak.
And did anyone struggle or run into, real danger or trouble on that trip?
Certainly no danger. Yes, everybody struggled on summit day, all of us, including myself, but everybody else either, I think a few of the group didn't leave high camp, and then probably half to 3/4 of the group left high camp to head out for the summit and turned around at various points.
And so Duncan Chesler, I presume, then suggested Everest might be the next step.
So that suggestion came as to come along and experience a big expedition, because I'd started working for Duncan at that point. And so having done 6,500 metres, the idea was to come along, so this was in 2007, and experience the massive logistical nightmare that is an Everest, let alone an 8,000 metre peak expedition. And my personal goal was to have a crack at 7,000 metres and maybe a little bit higher, up to 7,500 or so, if things were going well. So on the north side, this is in Tibet, that meant that to go above the North Pole, which I thought if I'm feeling good, I'd like to have a go, that actually meant that I had to have a summit permit. So you can get a permit to 7,000 metres or a summit permit, nothing in between. So I was like, well, I'd be devastated if I got to 7,000 metres and feeling good and could go just a few hundred metres more. So I'd got the summit permit and I was assisting and working on that trip up until we were climbing. Obviously, I couldn't even pretend to be a guide on the mountain at that point. But then, having the summit permit, and it got to the summit push, and I just kept on going a lot further than anybody, let alone myself, expected.
Where did you end up on that final day?
So we ended up from advanced base camp. So on the north side, you have base camp, as you do on the south side in Nepal, which is what most people think of when they're talking about Everest. So the north side base camp is at about 5,500 metres. Then up to 6,400 metres is advanced base camp, and that's where we started our summit push from. So you've then got 3 camps above advanced base camp, which includes the North Col, a second camp, and then high camp. And I left high camp on summit day.
Right.
So high camp is at about 8,200, 8,100 metres. So I actually got to about 8,000. We estimated it was 8,450 metres on that summit day.
And what turned you around?
So at that point, it was a combination of factors. Obviously, I just simply did not have the experience. And so everything, and you would find this with what you do, that if you know what you're doing, you're efficient and you conserve energy. This was my second mountain ever. And so the basics of looking after myself in the tent and boiling water, making food, putting my gear out, finding my glove on summit day or summit night, things like that just took an inordinate amount of time because it was not second nature. So that combined with the fact that 2 months before I had smashed my ankle and it had healed but quite badly. So in the days actually on the trip before the summit push, I'd be sort of hobbling around camp on the rocks, and I got it looked at when I got back. It was bone on bone. So it was pretty uncomfortable. So that combined with the lack of skill. So I got to a point where I think I was just too tired to be able to get up this really narrow crack where the snow just kept on falling down and I just couldn't couldn't get up.
Is that more technical, the approach from the north side?
It is slightly more technical. So on the south side, you have the Hillary Step, which everyone's heard of. On the north side, all above High Camp, you have, not very imaginatively named, the first, second and third step, but they're each. So the second step's the most technical one, and that'd be approximately 33 metres of cliff. It's not a high-grade technical rock climbing, but it's a serious scramble, and so there are ladders and ropes and so on. So all of that combined makes it slightly more technical and harder, but you don't have to go through the icefall.
Which seems like the most dangerous part of the climb from the south.
In some ways, it's the part of the climb where you can be the best, strongest, most careful climber, and wrong spot, wrong time, and a piece of ice the size of a bus could land on your head. There's nothing you can do about that.
So that's an interesting point for me because, in my pursuit of cave diving, I feel like all the risks, or 99% of the risks, come from within. As a cave diver, it's a very cerebral thing. It's all about controlling fear and emotion, and the occasional times when you do run into some strife, then almost always, if you can remain calm, there's a way to solve the problem and extricate yourself. However, in mountaineering, it seems that there's so much outside your control, the way you'll respond to the altitude, the vagaries of the weather and the mountain itself and other people. How do you cope with that risk of stuff that's outside your control?
When it comes down to it, there is a portion of it that is completely outside of your control. But what you do in the lead up is minimise that proportion. So you start with the team that you're climbing with. There's not much you can do about the other teams on the mountain, but your immediate people that you're climbing with, so that's the other Westerners and the Sherpas that are with you. So you make sure you have great Sherpas, which so many of them are, but they are going to be there. They're going to look after you. They know their job. So that's your people. Climbing the north side was a decision that, because there's a lot less people. So compared to the south side, there'd probably be generally around a third in total of the people climbing. So that just means you do not have the situations where you've seen, and the photos have obviously gone viral, hundreds of people. I've tried to count the dots on some of those photos, and there'd be a couple of hundred people in some of them just queued on the ropes. You don't get that on the north side because there's just not that many people there. And then, so for both years that I was on Everest, we took one of the later windows to have a crack at the summit. So everybody else went in an earlier window, which is probably only 5-6 days earlier, but you clear the mountain of everybody and go on a later window. So the day, and I was actually looking at the list earlier today because today is the 10th anniversary of my summit. So I had one of my fellow summiteers on the phone. We were going through who and how many actually summited on our day. 30 people were going from High Camp to the summit on the day that we summited. So that's a conscious decision as to when you're going to be on the ropes. The weather, you get the best forecasts that you can and have the technology with you to be able to check on that. Again, it's nature. It can be unpredictable, but you do everything you can to be as informed as you possibly can. And also, so on that trip, obviously I wasn't the one in charge by any stretch, but you've got staff, Sherpas and Duncan were the ones that were, obviously they'd summited many times before, some of the Sherpas. They are in a physical and mental position to be able to be keeping an eye on the weather and make decisions. So the rest of us might not have been. We were pretty focused on ourselves and where our feet were going, but you've got people with you that are keeping an eye on the weather, and they can and have to make the decision if it changes and a storm's coming in. It's like, sorry, turn around. So that's another factor that you can assess, how fit and ready you are and what your skill set is before you go. That's within your control.
I actually heard Duncan Chessel speak, and he's a very good speaker. And of course, any talk about Everest is a huge draw card because the imagery is so spectacular, and no doubt that's a huge part of the reason why people want to visit the top of the world. And he talked a lot about the risk management in terms of, you have to be at a certain point by a certain time. You have to have not used a certain amount of oxygen by a certain time. All these things that are a hard line, which mean you must turn and descend if you haven't hit those targets, and very much like cave diving. We have very strong rules about gas reserves and so forth. So I can see that there are ways to minimise the risks that you've talked about.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you have that plan, and that was discussed when everybody was still at sea level and not feeling the effects of altitude and summit fever. We had a plan, and there were people around us that would keep us to that plan if, for whatever reason, we decided that it was keep on going no matter what. So, yeah, there was a definite plan, and everyone was committed to coming back alive with all their fingers and toes. So.
And people obviously are very invested in the summit attempt, though, aren't they? They've paid a great deal of money for their permit and spent months of their life just in Nepal or Tibet, and of course years perhaps of training before then. And so when it comes to that point that it's time to turn back because they haven't hit that mark, I can see why some people get summit fever and push on. Against all logic, it must be very hard sometimes to turn around.
It is for them, and even if they've got people around them that are trying to do the right thing by them and turn them around, it can be difficult. So certainly on our summit day, we were bookended with deaths. So there were at least 3 deaths in 2010, and one of them was the evening just before we headed out in the early hours for our summit, and the other one was later that night. So, but both of those people were on the descent. And so that is where you do think that the summit fever has kicked in, and they've continued ascending well past the time that they should have, and they just haven't had enough in the tank to descend. And certainly, I think it must have been 1 or 2 years ago now, when there was a massive death count on the peak. I was talking to the guy that I work with in Kathmandu, and he was relating one of the fatalities was one of their team, an Indian climber. And he said the Sherpas were working so hard to, first of all, look after this climber, but also a number of times saying, you need to turn around. You're not coping. You're not doing well. You're not able to summit. And this climber just ignored them and continued ascending, and is quite possibly still there.
What does it feel like walking past the bodies of dead climbers?
Obviously, it's very sad, but I think at that point, well, certainly for myself, we all knew that there were 10 years ago a couple of sort of landmark bodies, unfortunately. That Green Boots is the famous one, who's I think now been removed, but he was a climber that had been there since the 90s, and he had these obviously green boots on. He was just to the side of the path. For myself, I took it as a reminder. It's okay. Reassess, stop, think. How are you feeling? How's your oxygen? How are the legs? How all your digits, and is everything all in good form to be able to keep on going? And if not, think about it, because you don't want to end up like that.
Yeah, I saw a photo of Green Boots, and he looks quite restful actually in his with his head towards this little cave, and you can't really make out any of his features. He just looks like someone sleeping on the slopes, and he's been there for so long. But I imagine some of the bodies are not quite as attractive to walk past. So, it must be confronting. Very much a reminder of the seriousness of the undertaking. Absolutely,
because by that point there's no point in basically just freaking out. It's like, well, you're here. You need to stay calm, as we were discussing before, but also remind yourself that you don't want to end up like that. There was certainly another body just sort of I think it was at the bottom of the 3rd step, which was out in the open, but looked very similar. It just looked like a down suit in the snow. This body, a figure curled up. There was one other one that was pretty graphic with bones bared and so on, and that was certainly even more confronting. But you just have to take it as a reminder. You know that they are there.
So knowing that there are risks and some of them can't be mitigated, what's the thing that drives you to do a mountain like Everest? Because it's the one thing I don't really understand, even as an explorer myself. For me, exploration is doing something that hasn't been done before, as well as a challenge to myself. I guess they're the two motivating factors. To find something that's unexplored or unseen by other people is a huge driver for me. And yet Everest, is so well visited these days, and yet remains still very dangerous. So if you could describe to me, why did you want to do it?
Because the opportunity was offered, very much so, in that I guess the whole experience for me is about doing something amazing in an amazing destination with really great people. And I can pretty much say every personal trip that I've done, every expedition, especially when I reach out to people, to friends who I've made over the years to say, let's go and climb such and such a mountain, it's been the most brilliant experience because I'm with people that are just great to spend 4, 5, 6, 7 weeks of your life with in very testing circumstances and terrain. So for me, the only reason I went to Everest was because the opportunity was there, and certainly both of the Everest teams that I was on the mountain with were just brilliant people that are scattered across the world, but a few of them are still really quite close friends. I've got one friend in London that whenever I'm in London, I'll give him a call. And we were pack rafting down the Thames a couple of years ago because I hadn't seen him for about 3 years, but I was there and he said, okay, come on, let's go and do something fun. You do come across people that are amazing and not quite so amazing. So on the big mountain trips, they're generally, I've always had people in the team that are just great people, and they've stepped up and come through thick and thin in really testing circumstances.
And did you learn anything about yourself on the expedition where you did summit?
Certainly what I was capable of. As we were saying before, I had never thought that I'm going to climb Everest one day. So that first opportunity, I really did just fall into it because it was offered, and I'll give it a crack to over 7,000 metres. And because I kept going and actually did come so close to the summit, it meant that it was like, this is something I probably can achieve. So that was why I came back 3 years later. It was like, oh, goodness, with no training, a badly healed, quite painful broken ankle, I almost summited. Got to give this a go. And one of the guys on that first team didn't summit either. He turned around at about 8,600 metres, I think. And he was coming back that year. And so it was one of those things that it was like, well, wow, I actually think I can do it. So I have to go back and have another go.
So do you think for most people it's a personal quest to see if they're up to the challenge of something so extraordinary?
Everest is very unique. I think, unfortunately, for many people it's ticking a box. And that's not the right approach, I don't think, to Everest. It is dangerous, and to just tick a box to say that you've done it is not an approach that I take on board for myself. It was, for me, being in the environment with the people, as I've already said. So I think there's a lot of different motivations for people climbing Everest. Many are just, I'm going to throw money at it and tick that box, and then I can be the bloke or it is normally the bloke, I have to say, at the dinner party. Oh, yeah, I summited Everest. And sometimes those people have done nothing else and do nothing else after.
I mean, there is still a mystique around someone who's summited Everest. I have to say I can't meet, and I've only met a few, but the people I've met, including yourself, I cannot help but revere them for having achieved what does seem to be an enormous physical and mental challenge. And actually I feel the same way about your marathons and triathlons, because from my own ordinary attempts at long-distance running, for example, I find that mental toughness that is required to push through the pain barrier that comes with those sort of endurance commitments is really important. And it takes strong people mentally to do all of those things that you've been involved in. So I think it speaks volumes for the type of people who get to the top, whatever their initial motivation.
I'm just not sure what those volumes are sometimes.
Well,
they could be.
Sometimes in a bad day at work, do you ever think, well, bugger this, I've climbed Everest, I can do anything. I mean, does that give you strength in those sort of situations?
Absolutely. Certainly some of the stuff that I've done gives me just, an inner confidence that's like, well, I've lived through that, especially in our beautiful city of Adelaide where we live, first world problems. It's like, well, don't sweat it. I can overcome it. And certainly things like public speaking, which had I been asked 10, 12, 15 years ago to get up on a stage and talk, I would have been a completely frozen, babbling mess. Whereas now, and it's I still find it incredibly flattering and a bit baffling that people want me to get up and talk about myself. But I can do it happily and comfortably without falling apart from nerves because I've summited Everest. I survived that.
And as long as you've got a few good photographs to show, I think the crowd is always on your side.
Oh, absolutely, yes. I will never speak without photos. It's like, well, I can talk, but the photos are far more interesting.
I absolutely hear you. I'm speaking with Katie Serra, Adelaide born and bred mountaineer, and one of the few women really who has been hugely successful in this sport of mountaineering. Is that a true statement, Katie? Is it a male-dominated sport?
It is certainly very male-dominated in that most of the expeditions I've done, certainly the big ones, have been pretty much all with males. I've been the only female on the team. There are certainly some extraordinary female climbers dotted around the world, but certainly on Everest, if you go through the Everest summit lists, it's a very small proportion of women.
Is there any disadvantage to climb Everest as a woman? I imagine going to the toilet above 8,000 metres has a brief disadvantage.
Oh, yes, and unfortunately it's not that brief either. It's that's not a good one. Yes, so certainly there are some disadvantages like that. If you've got a down suit and a harness and you're on a fixed rope that you really don't want to unclip from, then yes, tending to any ablutions can be tricky, to say the least. But I just got to the point where it'd be like, guys, got to go. You look that way, you look the other way. Give me a moment. And I've certainly done that plenty of times. It's just one of those practical things. But as far as women, I'm not quite sure why, to be honest. I think it might be I couldn't possibly do that, even though I'd love to. It's like, well, why not? I guess for myself, I was incredibly lucky in that I did have 3 young boys at the time. So they were aged 8, 10 and 11, I think, when I went to Everest the first time. And I had a husband that was able to step up and manage home and with family help so that I could go away for 6 weeks. And so certainly not everyone has that luxury. Otherwise, I'm not quite sure why. I believe that many women could do probably almost all, if not many, of the mountains that I have summited. So the challenge is out there.
It seems to be a theme in all extreme athletes or adventure sports that it is dominated by men. But as you say, there's no physical or mental or other reason why it shouldn't be equal. As a mother, how did that sit with you to go away and do something risky with 3 kids? I mean, it shouldn't be any different than for a father, but I think it is. Do you agree?
It shouldn't, but it is, I believe. I've been very fortunate in that I've been asked that a couple of times, but everyone has never asked it in an accusatory manner. It's always been, so how did you manage it? Or how did you feel? So for me, I was definitely managing the expectations and the risk. So there was absolutely every guarantee that I'm not on a summit or die mission. I will come home and I will have all my fingers and toes, but primarily I'll come home alive to my family. And that was the promise that I made, including a promise to my husband, look, I will never be alone on the mountain, all that sort of stuff. Even that can be something that something goes wrong, and if there's no one there to help you, then, and whether that's a bloke or a female, that can prevent you from coming home. So it was managing the risks and expectation around that, and I think that the understanding and support from the family that this was something that I needed to do, and I mean certainly there are risks crossing the street at home, and it was a matter of this is what I'm striving to do, this is what I need to achieve, and they understood that.
How important was it to you to do that expedition? You know, if your husband had said, I'd rather you didn't, would that have caused conflict?
It would have caused discussions. If he really couldn't have coped and it was a marriage breaker, then yeah, absolutely I would have had to rethink very hard. Was my marriage worth it? Absolutely not. So,
were you a mountaineer when you got married?
No, and so I guess I do because the first Everest trip was very hard for my husband because it was the first big mountain that I'd done, and it was all just so unknown. So, of course, over the years it certainly got easier. But that first time was very hard on him because it was something that just came out of left field in my mid-30s. We were married when we were 22, and we had the boys when I was aged 26 to 29. That was so much not on the horizon as something I was going to do, that to have thrown that at my husband was a big curveball, shall I say.
But I suspect he knew he was married to a highly motivated, goal-focused person with your long-distance running and triathlons.
Well, see, I blame him for those. So I followed him into triathlon and running. So he was a really good runner in his 20s, but he had a car accident when he was younger. So that marathon career finished probably by the age of 30 or so. But he was the one that led me into triathlon and running. So it's really sort of his fault.
Oh, that's good. That's good. I can't blame Fiona, my wife, for my cave diving, but at least I was diving when we met, so I didn't sneak up on her with a surprise like that.
Yeah, so I think for them to have to, as a partner, when your spouse is going overseas for long trips, doing something risky, that yes, it needed a lot of understanding on my behalf to go, well, yeah, this is coming out of nowhere, so we need to deal with that together.
He's obviously very supportive of what you do because it has been a successful marriage as far as I can see, and you're still together. But do you see the worry in his face when you're leaving? Do you feel guilty about that?
He doesn't. I mean, after all these years, I'll get a stay safe, come home, and and that's about it really, because he knows what I'm capable of and what my risk assessment is around a trip. So I went to do an 8,000 metre peak 2 years ago now. I did Manaslu in Nepal, and that was far more straightforward and easier for him to deal with because I had already summited an 8,000 metre peak. He knew how it all unfolds. And I mean, yes, summit day, when you're out of contact for 24 hours, then that phone call of, hi, honey, I'm fine. I'm not home, but I'm on my way home. As of now, the trip starts home after you've come down from the summit. So that's always a huge relief. I'm aware of that. But I would say that the concern and worry for 99% of the trip is now vastly reduced.
What about other friends or maybe other mothers in particular? Do you ever get sort of those looks from them to say, you selfish woman, what are you doing?
Oh, they think I'm mad. I mean, and I do accept that mountaineering is in some ways a selfish thing to do, but I am very much there for my family when I'm here. So it'll be those blocks of time when I'm away on the trip. So I don't play golf for 6 hours on a weekend every weekend.
That's what I say to Fiona.
See, that covers a multitude of sins.
I don't gamble and I don't smoke, I tell her.
Absolutely, yeah. See, those aren't my vices either. So unless I'm actually training for an Ironman or something like that, I mean, and of course now that's been a more recent thing anyway. But back in those days, I didn't have anything that would take me away from the family for 6 hours on a weekend. So I was very much there as a mother and wife for all the time that I was actually in the country.
So tell us about the 7-7. What did that involve?
Right, so the 7 Summits is the highest peak on each continent. The 7-7 is the highest peak on each continent plus the highest volcano on each continent. All this is going to test me now. So the highest volcanoes on each continent are Pico de Orizaba in Mexico, then Ojos del Salada in South America, Sidley in Antarctica, Mount Galui in Papua New Guinea is Australasia, then Damavand in Europe, and then you've got Elbrus and Kilimanjaro for...
Oh, you get 2 for 1.
2 for the price of 1.
Nice.
Yeah.
Is climbing a volcano very different to climbing a mountain? Are they all classic volcano shape or are they completely different from each other?
They're all very different. So Ojos was spectacular. So that was a real volcano. You got up to the top and it had the crater in the middle and it was this perfect round shape of a volcano. Whereas, for example, Galui it had obviously at some point, tens of thousands of years ago, completely blown its top So to look at it, you wouldn't really pick unless you're a geologist or knew what you were looking at. Just your run-of-the-mill person off the street like myself wouldn't pick it as a volcano. So they're all different.
And now the next quest is the Explorers Grand Slam. Do you want to tell me what that means?
So the classic Explorers Grand Slam is the 7 summits plus ski the last degree to each of the poles. I was only the 8th or 9th person in the world to have ever done both the 7 summits and the 7 volcanic summits. And then only, as of beginning of last year, only about three people, I think, had done the Grand Slam as well. December 18 months ago, I went down to the South Pole, down to Antarctica, and skied the last degree to the South Pole. And then for the first time last year, April, I attempted to ski to the North Pole, but we didn't even get to leave Norway because there was political issues that meant we couldn't leave Norway and land on the sea ice. And then because that trip was cancelled, we had planned to go April this year. Some global issues have unfortunately put that trip off again. So I'm 1 pole away from the Explorers Grand Slam plus 7.
Well, that will be a remarkable achievement. And will you plan to try again next year?
I will, just because the team that we had together last year it looked as though it was going to be a great fun team. It was going to be really good. And the guy that I was working with to put the team into the field, he's an Australian polar guide, Eric Phillips, and I was really looking forward to doing a trip with him. So someone like that, to be able to be on a trip and learn from them is a great experience. So to do a trip with someone as experienced as Eric is going to be wonderful. And I mean, it is that last in the list. So I love a list. I'm Virgo. I love a spreadsheet and I love a list. And it will frustrate me if I don't get to do that last trip. And the North Pole will be quite different from the South Pole as well. So to actually experience that trip with a great group, it gets back to the list I was talking about before of why I do stuff. Amazing location, great people.
One of my greatest fears in the world is bears, so the North Pole doesn't really appeal to me, but I would love to go to Antarctica and dive down there in particular and see some of the stuff under the ice there. Apparently it's extraordinary. How far is 1 degree of latitude, I presume, at the pole?
It's about 111 kilometres.
And how do you get to 111 kilometres from the pole? Do you catch a ride with someone?
Absolutely, yes. So for the South Pole, there's a base down there, Union Glacier, which the ALE is the company that runs all private expeditions in inner Antarctica. So they run that base and they run trips for the South Pole and climbing the peaks. So I've climbed Vinson with them, I've climbed Sidley and done the South Pole. So it's flying from the bottom of Chile in Punta Arenas, and you fly from there to the base, and then on a big Russian Aleutian cargo plane. And then from Union Glacier, you then get a little twin otter usually to fly to wherever you're starting, whatever trip you're doing.
Tell me about climbing Mount Vinson. Was that tough?
That was an amazing trip. So again, that was my first of the 7 summits. As it happened, I started the 7 summits with Vinson and then finished the 7 volcanoes with Sidley. So Antarctica was on either end of my 7-7 list of peaks.
You hadn't done Kosciuszko already?
No.
There you go.
So I ended up going up Kosciuszko that must have been, I think it was just before the Everest trip in 2010, because I went with my English pack rafting friend and my German friend from Byron Bay. Both had been on the Everest summit team. So we did Kosciuszko together as a pep talk for me about to head off to do Everest. Yes, and I hadn't done Kosciuszko prior. Mount Vinson, that was an amazing trip because that was the first of the 7 summits that I actually did summit, because it was post the first Everest trip. And that was a trip that Duncan put together, and it was a trip that did not take the standard route that all of the client climbers take. So we were dropped on the other side of the peak. I think it has been repeated by a couple of guides since, but certainly no groups or clients had done it before, and no groups have done it since. So it was an amazing, just completely isolated because it was just our team of 8 dropped in the middle of nowhere. There weren't the camps and the setups that you have in the standard Vinson climb. So this twin otter is sort of flown from the camp to drop us off, sort of circling around to find a spot. And at this point, I'm just sitting there going, oh my God, I don't even know if I can pull a sled. I wonder if I stay on the plane, will anyone notice? Because I just don't want to let the team down. But I got over that and got off the plane. And then the twin otter took off and we were thousands of kilometres from anyone. It was very daunting.
Must be the most isolated climb in the world.
I would say Sidley is possibly even more isolated. So certainly we had nobody around us for Vinson. But I guess, there would have been teams on the other side of the mountain. We actually didn't see anybody. So as we climbed the mountain, because we came from the other side, sort of like Everest, if you climb from the north side or the south side, if you time it either well or badly, depends on how you look at it, you could meet with other teams at the top. So for Vinson, we didn't actually see anybody, but their base camps and the group stuff that the ALE were running would have been over there. So a few hundred kilometres away, I guess, from where we were at any point in time, whereas Sidley is a really long way from nowhere. So it's probably a couple of hours to Vinson because the base camp is near Vinson, whereas Sidley, we actually had to refuel the Twin Otter on the way. It was a number of hours of flying just to get to the peak, to the extent that it was very rock star. We left the base, refueled, get to the volcano, and this pilot lands us in the crater of the volcano, and they stayed with us for 5 or 6 days while we climbed the peaks. It just wasn't worth, and horrendously expensive for the plane to go back with all the refueling and then come back to get us. So we had our pilot, second pilot and mechanic hanging around in their little Twin Otter while we're climbing. So it was a pretty amazing experience.
Beautiful. What's the altitude of Vinson?
So Vinson's not that high. It's around 5,000 metres. Being so close to the pole, it feels higher, like the effects of the altitude are more. Same with Denali, because it's so far north. The further you get away from the equator, the altitude can affect you more than if you were at that altitude.
Was that a straightforward climb?
So Vinson was reasonably straightforward, but because it was route finding, it was where no one else had ever been. There were a couple of sections and this was very early on in my climbing career, so there were a few sections that tested me. And for me, it was very much a skills acquisition trip as well, because I was planning. I'd already been to Everest the first time and I was planning to go back. So for me, it was an amazing skills acquisition as to how to look after myself in these extreme environments.
What sort of temperatures did you experience up there?
Really hard to tell with Vincent. I remember looking at a thermometer at one point and I think it only went down to about minus 25 degrees and it had bottomed out. Right. So I remember we were setting up camp and it was just bitterly cold. If it's blue sky and not windy and you're moving, it's not actually, well, I tend to find it not too bad. It's as long as you're moving, then it can be okay. But yeah, once you get some wind and if you can't keep especially if you're not working hard, so pulling a sled, anything like that, and if it's not really windy, then minus 25, 26 is actually bearable because you're keeping warm. But yeah, being in one place and the wind coming up is not pleasant.
So have you faced any frightening moments on the mountains? Anything that's where you've thought this was a mistake being here? I'm looking down the barrel right now.
Well, certainly that Vinson trip, as I mentioned, there were a couple of spots that I just found a little bit frightening. There was one spot and then we had to go through it several times because we had left some base supplies down lower, but we were starting to head up the peak, and so we were load carrying. It meant that we obviously had, because we were load carrying, we had heavy packs, and we had to go back up and down a few times to stock this higher camp. And I just found it quite frightening terrain. It was moderately steep, but not steep enough to warrant fixed ropes. But the ice to me just felt really unstable. And it was steep, and if I'd slipped or the ice had gone, I was pretty much gone. So that involved a lot of calming breathing and watching every step.
Because I believe avalanches are probably the leading cause of fatalities on the certainly the Himalayan mountains. Are avalanches much on your radar when you're climbing in these sort of places?
They certainly are, but it's a matter of assessing the terrain, and there are certainly slopes and inclines that are far more prone to avalanche just because of the degree of the incline and the build-up of snow and that sort of thing. So it was interesting that avalanche is the highest cause of fatalities.
Himalayan database, I think that came from. So
yeah, no, that they know their stuff, so that must be true. I guess because I've never been in or near any sort of avalanche, all of the fatalities that I've come across have been from AMS or exhaustion or accident. Falls, yeah.
Yep.
Injury.
I just want to ask you a little bit about your views on the current trends of Everest climbing, and I know all mountaineers must get asked about this, but that photograph that Nirmal Purja or NIMS took last year of that queue up to the summit of Everest was horrifying, I think, for someone like myself to see such a pristine environment so overcrowded, and the risks that even I can see that brings to the climbers who are caught in that traffic jam. And interestingly, I mean, you yourself, although you've proved to be extremely adept in this environment, kind of did go the fast path from Mount Lofty to Mount Everest, and quite easily you could have been one of those people caught up in that kind of thing as an inexperienced climber. So what do you think about, someone like me, if I can afford the time and the cash, should I be allowed to attempt a summit on Everest?
If it's purely a matter of you've got the cash and enough to throw at somebody to take you up there, then definitely not. I guess, you're completely correct. Going pretty much from a 6,500 metre peak to Everest is definitely not what I would recommend. And, the proof is in the results. I did not summit that time, and I didn't deserve to summit. I was extremely careful and conservative in what I was doing, but I had also, and I guess my approach has always been that if I don't know an area or a peak, and that started back when I knew nothing, you get the best. You get people who absolutely know exactly what they're doing, and they're not negligent risk takers, ones that will assess the risks and do it carefully and properly within the parameters of the expedition, of course. So for me, that first trip to Everest was, as I said earlier, it was very much about never expecting to get anywhere near the summit, anywhere near as high as I did. It was go a bit higher and get some experience. Although it might sound a little bit hypocritical, because I did get so far that first time, that wasn't the intent, that wasn't the goal. And I'm very strongly that at a minimum you need to do, as I did do, a 6,500 metre peak. And then in the perfect world, you actually do at least a number of peaks, but at least a couple more before even thinking about Everest. And that is, in the end, what I did do. So I would always suggest a 7,000 metre peak plus, and then another 8,000 metre peak before having a go at Everest. So it just happens that my first 8,000 metre peak was 8,500 metres on Everest instead of summiting Manaslu or Shishapangma or something like that.
It's a huge conflict for the Nepalese, I suppose. A large part of their economy comes from this mountain and the mountains around it, and yet they, I'm sure, don't want to see either the mountain littered with equipment and bodies, nor do they want to see their own people dying on the mountain, the Sherpas who have to look after the visiting climbers. So do you think it's a problem that can be managed by Nepal?
My understanding is that they have started taking steps, certainly after last year, and I haven't actually looked recently. I've been far too wound up in my own lack of ability to get to the North Pole. My understanding is that they were implementing rules that at a minimum you had to have done another 6,500 metre peak. I'll very happily see them take it the extra step of you have to do another 8,000 metre peak. And all credit to them, most of them are in, or many of them are in Nepal, so Nepal or Tibet. So, and that Tibet is often, you need to have Sherpas with you as well as Tibetans, so it's still work for the locals. So that's a bit of a win-win as far as I'm concerned for the government, that if they did implement that, then they actually do get more income and people get the experience that they need before approaching the peak.
I mean, it's interesting that some of the smaller peaks, slightly smaller peaks like K2, have a reputation of being far more difficult and very much more dangerous than Everest. And yet Everest, just because it's that few hundred metres higher, is the big draw card for everyone.
It is, yes, because it is the highest, and really it is more approachable in some ways. K2 is just completely not on my list, ever, in spite of one friend of mine trying to convince me that I should come with him. But it's like, well, no, I just don't think that is worth the risk. Everest technically is a lot less difficult than something like K2. And you look at Annapurna and a number of the other 8,000 metre peaks, and you not only have the above 8,000 metre altitude challenges, but you then throw highly technical climbing into that mix, and it's a completely different ballgame. So Everest is probably one of the, except for the extreme height, is one of the easier 8,000 metre peaks.
Yeah, again, that Himalayan database suggests that K2 and Annapurna can have fatality rates of 1 in 4 for summiteers, for people who do that last summit push. So
massive, yeah.
That surely must put it in the realms of madness, really, that kind of risk equation.
Unless you are a completely prepared, highly technical, experienced climber, then definitely. And there's a book called Savage Summit, which was about, and this was written back in the mid 2006 or 8, I think. And it's the story of, by then, only 6 women had ever summited K2. There'd been more since, but at that point, only 6. And it's the story of those 6 women. Of those 6 women, it was at least 2, if not 3 or 4 of them had died on the descent. So that just tells you how deadly that peak is. In fact, it was probably a few of them had died on the descent, and I think maybe one of them had died on another mountain. But certainly by 2006, there was only 1 or 2 of them that were still alive.
Katie, what does your bookshelf look like?
At the moment, it is absolutely chock-a-block. I'm an eclectic, avid reader. So I have everything from Lord of the Rings, Jane Austen, Jack Reacher, Terry Goodkind. I've got science fiction, fantasy, detective, literary classics, massive number of books in my library.
Would I find books like Touching the Void or Into Thin Air up there?
Absolutely. So then, you have my fiction fun stuff, and then there's definitely the climbing section as well, which is a significant part of the shelf. And then, certainly there's a number of good old Lonely Planet for different trips and climbing books and all that sort of thing as well. So yes, definitely all of the classic mountaineer novels are there.
So what's next for Katie Sarah? If you can tick off the North Pole in the near future, is there another mountain?
Definitely yes. Exactly what peak? Just finding it really hard to set goals at the moment, which was why a month ago, having had the North Pole taken away and very uncertain as to when I could get overseas again, it was like, well, what can I do? Stuff it. I'll register for an Ironman. So I'm currently training for an Ironman, which might be I'm hoping, if they can run it, will be in September. But as far as mountains are concerned, I do have a friend who's on a second 7 mission. So the second 7 is the second highest mountain on each continent. And that's a nasty list. So that includes K2. I'm not joining him on the whole second 7. But there's 2 or 3 of the peaks that I would quite like to do because they look really interesting and fun, and I'd have fun people to do it with again. So Mount Logan, North America, second highest peak. That looks like fun, a little bit technical, but nothing too nasty and scary and nothing too terribly high. So that one. And then he wants to do the second highest peak in Antarctica, which if I can get out of Bankline to go back down to Antarctica, that would be that's a very technical climb, but it's not terribly high. Mount Tyree. That'd be pretty good fun if I can get down there again.
Well, Katie Sarah, your devotion to pain and suffering impresses me enormously. Thank you so much for joining me on Real Risk. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
That's it for this episode of Real Risk. If you're a risk taker or know someone who'd be good for the show, please send me an email on admin@speleopix.com.au. I'd love to hear from you. Let me know what you think of the podcast. Subscribe, give me a rating, but most importantly, join me for the next one. We'll see you again on Real Risk.